Hello, and welcome to the Keep Learning podcast. My name is Alicia Siska.
And I'm Matthew Mesley.
And today we have another special guest with us. He gave up his lab coat, STEM classrooms, and chemical jokes for workshops, tutorials, writing sessions, and editorials. He's learning advisor who'll make us wiser. A warm welcome to Dr. Jason Truscott.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so some cheering should go on.
Yeah, we need some cheering.
We'll put that in the background.
I'd like to say, first of all, thank you for having me both.
Well, thank you for coming. That's amazing. Tell us something about your background. For those of you who can't see us but only hear us, Jason has a very interesting background picture behind him.
Oh yes, sorry. Yes, this background is obviously not where I actually am really, but obviously it's a virtual background. But I thought it'd be fun because we're doing a podcast. If it looks like a recording studio, so that's kind of how I've gone about it. Really.
Excellent.
So I would like to have a place like this, but obviously I don't.
But it looks very cool. Very cool indeed. So Jason, will you tell us a few words about yourself and your role in the university and your interests and specialism?
Oh well, oh gosh, yeah. I have a kind of unusual background, I suppose, in the sense because I started off doing business studies, which is probably a bit weird. But I ended up taking a shine, if you like, an interest in an environmental science course. So I literally started out, and it was actually at college. I went to a college for that particular one, and then I ended up converting it into a degree in chemistry. And obviously, as things progress, you take it into PhD if you're fortunate enough to get into one of those positions. So that's kind of how I kind of move from one aspect to another. So it's a very long story, so I'm going to bore you with all the details of that.
But you're a master of all trades, it sounds.
Well, I maybe I'd like to think that, but I don't. I know a lot about nothing. But the thing is, it's still a very useful journey because you kind of see things from a different perspective, and you see how other people communicate things in different arenas and environments. So going from sort of a very much money orientated set of learning into something that's slightly more, I would say, probably middle of the road, because obviously we scientists kind of worry about the funding, but they also worry about the search for knowledge as well. So it's kind of an interesting in between there, really. And I took that a little bit further because I then I did a tiny little bit of consultancy, did a bit of lecturing, associate lecturing, and then I started to realize that actually it's the kind of the teaching aspect of it that I was actually getting the most buzz out of it. And I was thinking, actually, I've got this, I'm here now, why don't I take it somewhere else? And this is kind of how I've emerged into this direction of kind of teaching the generic skills, if you like, or the wider academic literacy, because it feels like a natural progression, and it feels like a way to link all of the weird digressions I've done with my learning over the years, really.
Sounds great. I love wiggly careers and these kind of very complicated ways in which we get to a certain point in life and how we can build on all these little turns and twists of fate, or a variety of experience. So that's fabulous, and I'm sure you find it every day. You find interesting uses of these previous experiences and knowledge in your job.
Fun enough, yes. And sometimes you kind of see the parallels between different areas and stuff, and I think that helps. As we're kind of like learning developers, it kind of helps to have those insights of different areas of study and how people direct things, because then I think that helps when you actually have to speak to somebody who isn't in your discipline about a particular skill set and what they might need from it. And it's less of a shock. I'm not saying that I'm never shocked, because that would be a bit pompous, but it's sometimes you kind of like, I can see, I think I know what you mean by that, and you can kind of link things together.
No, that's great. And so hold on, because today obviously the topic is academic posters. So how do they feature then in your work and your interests?
Well, it came about, I suppose, for the poster aspect of it, because I teach elements of obviously giving presentations of that sort, and and I was asked specifically to do something on posters. But equally, you kind of see that, across life, we have this sense of visual communication that happens. And funny enough, going back to my previous route of the business studies, where I actually did one in design and business, where you're kind of looking at the ideas about how companies represent or display their image, and that might be logos and so forth and stuff. So there is this sense of visual as a communication is quite important, because it gives people that insight into how they can push their idea forward and also communicate it to others that may not necessarily know the intricacies of their expertise in that sense.
Is that why you think it's such a useful skill for students?
Yeah, I think it is, because I think a lot of us don't necessarily. Well, I suppose I don't want to speak for everybody, because we don't all think we're budding artists. We don't know if we can create things.
I definitely do not think.
Well, this is it, and at one stage in my own life, I was kind of thinking to myself, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do a very good job of this. But when you're kind of given those kind of insights and it's communicated to you by the persons who have experience already, you start thinking, actually, I might be able to do something with this now, and be able to present something that's meaningful for somebody else to see. I don't know how you feel about it, but I always think there's a stage where you get to a point where you think you're doing a great job, and then you realize actually it's not as good as you might think. But I think part of that is the excitement, because you suddenly feel you have a skill you can push forward and develop, and I think it's a natural part of learning, really. As long as you're excited and you're happy to carry on growing, I think that's where it's important. But it's a bizarre one, really. If you can communicate in a number of different ways, I think that enriches your life, and it also enriches the life for others. And I think that's probably one way of looking at it. I think hence the poster being an important way of communicating it.
I like that point that you were saying about how you don't have to be an artist though to do a poster presentation. That if you're feeling anxious about it because of that, you can still do a good job.
Anxiousness or that anxiety usually the result of that visual element of the poster, because obviously students write lots of essays, so there's a lot of
familiar
elements. That's familiar, and that feels like something we know we can control. But then that visual element, and combining these two and finding the right balance between the visual and the textual, is that the major challenge, would you say?
I would say it is, actually, because there's often this sense of disconnect, that if you're you might like something visual that you see in your life more often than not, and you might want to try and include that, but it's out of context then, because sometimes you might have persons saying, well, is there any way I can put this image into my poster? And you think, well, how does that fit with what you're actually saying? And it's funny, because in a strange sort of way, we try and do that within our writing, because when we should be following an assignment brief, we're kind of trying to find the bits that we find most interesting and trying to force it in and trying to do that. Whereas if we can find something that is representative of what we're trying to say, I think that is a better experience, not only for the person's reading your work afterwards, but for you to be able to establish an understanding of why those images might fit better or not. And it's less about what you feel should be included in it. It's more about what will help others to understand what you're trying to say as well. I think there's an element of that. But I don't want to go to make it sound too deep and profound. But I think there's an easier way of actually doing that and creating images that make people connect. But we're never going to get it right first time. I think it's an important thing, and not to be too harsh and judging of yourself. And too disappointed, because there's a breakthrough point. It might be you create a good enough poster for the first one, but then you can think, if I could have done this or done that, maybe it could be better, and then you can take that knowledge and those techniques into your next one, I think, really.
Yeah. Actually, what you just said about images and how to select them, how to decide which one is the appropriate one, and that this is potentially a cause of some anxiety, or just a challenge. It reminded me of the history of posters because, I'm a cultural historian by heart. And so I did a little bit of research around academic posters. And it's quite interesting that obviously now academic posters can be found pretty much in every field, every institution of higher education. But they started out as a practice of the natural sciences. And only then evolved to encompass other fields, from the humanities to the social sciences. But so they surfaced first in the late 1960s, and they surfaced as cards. They were called kind of cards that included graphics, diagrams, pictures, but no text, actually. So they started as images, plain images, almost like memes today, right? And these images were supposed to convey the message. And I find it really, really interesting because when you look at the history of commercial or entertainment posters, they actually evolved from text, and only later on images were added. So it's a completely opposite kind of trajectory in terms of that evolution, And the text in terms of academic posters didn't enter the game until the kind of 1970s. So I think the first poster ever, a poster session as such at a conference, was introduced in 1975, it's a long time ago, at the American Physics Conference, and was very positive, and scientists loved it, and it became, the poster session became the norm at lots of conferences. Of course, not all conferences, and I think it's also important to know which conferences actually have it as an important and interactive element, and at which conferences actually it's more of an add-on,
or a second best.
Yeah. So it can have a different status, right, depending on your field and on the actual context of that presentation.
It's interesting actually, because you say that, because some of the things I wasn't aware of that, because haven't really looked into the history of it. But when you're saying that it was in those kind of like converted cards, it's funny because some of the very first posters I did for my PhD, actually, when I was taking it to conferences, was actually, this is probably showing my age a little bit as well, but was to print out things on A4 sheets, put it onto a specific coloured card, separate cards, and then laminate it. And then you would have all of these separate cards that you would align in the right order. So it wasn't one big poster; it was a sort of a compilation of all of the separate little components. But it's funny because that sounds exactly kind of like where it's come from in that sense, because it's that kind of like natural transition. Because I often wonder, why do we do it this way? But obviously it makes sense when you think to yourself that to have a poster printer historically was actually a very expensive thing to have, but now it's very commonplace within the university. You can usually find at least one somewhere. But then it was kind of
sorry. I was just thinking about this idea of using the visual aspect of it, because I sometimes have a sense that it's almost like we're going back in this direction a little bit. I mean, not so much to go back to the card format, but there is this encouragement. More and more I read in different types of advice for poster creation to not overwhelm viewers with too much text, to limit the text to the absolute minimum, and actually be a little bit more visual. Use this visual genre for what it is, for what it was meant to do. So do you feel that there is this kind of trend to maybe go back a little bit to that visuality of the poster?
I think there probably is. There's a phrase that popped in my head, and I don't know who it is, because obviously we should say who that is. A picture paints 1,000 words, isn't it? Is that right? I'm not sure who that is.
I'm not sure it's right, but the saying
something
is there.
Something along those lines, isn't it? Yeah. But
visual historians will take issue with that.
They probably will, and I would like to be corrected on that. But there is that element of there's so much more that comes from a visual experience sometimes, isn't it? That you can take from it, and if it has the right impact, if it has the right impression, that gives that right idea, it almost feels beyond words. But what I don't want to do is get away from the fact that writing words in an academic poster is obviously particularly important. But it actually lifts the whole of the purpose of what you're trying to get across. Mm. And if you do it in a way that's it's meaningful and it connects with the persons with you who are kind of sharing the poster experience, then I think it's a better experience. Yeah. And they come away by saying, I was really captured by the fact that you use that image here and I can relate to that. It might be they want to talk about an aspect of what that image was, and it might be simply from a scientific perspective. You show a picture of your laboratory or something, and you're kind of showing them this is where you actually completed the experiment. They say, "Oh, we got one of those in the," and it kind of encourages that conversation to happen. And I think that's something that's important to that posters represent.
Yeah. I wonder if it's also that poster presentations are a more flexible model as well, that there are a number of different approaches that you can take with them.
Yeah.
And that's why lecturers often find it useful, or use it as an assessment. And I know that also in terms of the Faculty of Health, for instance, text is striking back to some extent, because they often do poster presentations, and then you also have to write an essay that's associated with that poster presentation. Is that something that you find in your faculty as well?
I think you're right. It's usually sometimes in addition to something, or it's to enhance something that's already there. But the requirement of it is so important, because how can you put forward your ideas if you're only doing it in the written form? And I've got to be careful here, because we don't want to put people off from writing things, because we still need to have the detailed, rich information that we get from a paper or a journal article in that sense. But so
let's talk about that, because I think it's very important to maybe clarify how do we relate to that text on the poster? What kind of text are we talking about? How is it different from a text you would use in an essay, in a paper?
I personally, I kind of liken it, and I'm taking ideas, if you like, from things I've read as well. Because if you look at the majority of articles that talk about writing posters, they talk about it in the sense of almost being like an abstract. Mm. And I don't mean as in abstract imagery, as in an abstract as a shortened piece of writing that portrays the main essence of what you're trying to get across in your research or your writing at a university or where it might be. So it's a very clever way of summarizing the written form, but just enough to be able to capture somebody's ideas who are interested in perhaps the things you're studying, or they have a commonality or similar research background to you. And I think that's a talent in its own right, but it still allows most people to say, well, if I can write a fairly good abstract, then surely I can then apply that to a poster. So having that kind of that skill set, I think probably would help a lot. I don't know how you feel about it, but that's how I kind of look at it, really. But when you speak to others, they might have slightly different opinions of that. But
no, I think that skill of synthesizing ideas is very important in a poster. But I think it's also important to use a very accessible language, and maybe a bit simpler, plainer language than we would because we don't really have the same space to develop an idea, right? So it needs to be communicated faster. Especially that when you think about a poster presentation, for example, at a conference, or even on the wall of a university corridor, right? People kind of walk by, right, and look at them. But unlike a paper read by the presenter, the information that is taken in in at the viewer's own pace. Yeah, they can linger on certain elements, and they choose those elements. They're not controlled by the poster maker. You can just linger on the areas that you are interested in, and you can obviously then engage often in a conversation with the researcher, etc. But it's like literally, it allows people to look into someone's research. Yeah, but the challenge is attention. People stroll by and don't necessarily look carefully unless something grabs that attention. So how do you grab attention?
As in, how would I grab the attention?
What's the best advice? How would you do it? How do you advise? I think it literally varies in how what I suppose what you're studying. I suppose really, isn't it? That's the thing. So it's about knowing a little bit about your own self, about your discipline, and what really attracts you towards that discipline specifically. But equally, I want to go back to what you were saying a minute ago about the corridors of having posters on there, because that's I kind of remember it quite openly, and I think they still do it. Is they would put posters up, the most recent posters in the corridors of the science block, and you'll kind of walk through, and you'll kind of your eye will kind of be caught by certain posters for certain reasons. And it might be that it's associated with that you'd never seen in a piece of instrumentation like that or something, perhaps, or you just thought there was an unusually large pieces of data on one particular set, or the graph looked particularly interesting. But it was something about it that literally stood out from the others. But equally, it's a lot of it's about what the actual title was as well, because what words were used in the title, and particularly complex ones sometimes are intriguing, because you're just thinking, what is that all about? So you want to go have a closer look and find out what it is, but equally you don't want to be sort of distracted or frightened of the poster because you're thinking it looks too complicated to be able to understand. So there's such an unusual balance with that, and I often wonder to myself, what was it that actually captured my interests? And perhaps that's the sort of thing that I should be trying to incorporate into my own posters, so that other people would have the same reaction that I was having. But it's obviously not just about me. It's obviously how other people will react to it, and obviously getting some feedback from your colleagues or friends or family or whatever situation you're in, just to see what their impressions are of it when they first look at it. What do you think of this? What was the thing that jumped out at you the most, first of all? And I think that's probably kind of the way we should look at posters in that sense. But you mentioned titles, and I suppose titles are important because they will either encourage us to engage with it or maybe discourage and say, oh, no, this is not necessarily what I'm interested in. But also maybe, I don't know, headlines or some sort of, you mentioned numbers maybe which are highlighted, or colors. What about colors? Is there any code, any kind of a set of guidelines about colors and their meaning?
Yeah, I suppose I've got to be careful because I'm like I said, I don't claim myself to be an artist, but and obviously those who do the arts will be saying that's not quite right. But I think it's somehow a proper use of the primary colours sometimes is a good way of making an impact on a particular poster. So and I've seen certain people using that. If you use a particular type of red or a yellow in certain instances. I'm not saying you should mix and match these because you've got to be careful about how these colors go, but that might create the initial, gosh, look at that, that really stands out. And why does it stand out? And I know from the scientific perspective that the eye is particularly sensitive to green. So perhaps certain greens or something might be helpful, but what you've got to be careful with is that if you try and incorporate every single element of those colors in there, it becomes garish and then it kind of shocks for the wrong reasons. But I think perhaps it's just being aware of how those different colors impact on you. And of course, I've got to be sensitive here as well, because obviously there are persons who have a certain color blindness here, and there's nothing wrong with the color blindness. Let's put that quite right, but it's how that is perceived by them as well. So you have to, in the sense, you have to think about the accessibility of it. I do remember one particular colleague I worked with, and we created a poster, and I thought it'd be great to have a black background for a poster with some red writing here. But then he actually highlighted to me at the time that if you put red writing onto a black background, it's like it's not there for me because I can't actually see it. So instantly I was kind of thinking, right, okay, so you can go so far with color, but you get to the point where you actually disadvantage somebody else. So I started looking very carefully a bit, about how I would actually approach that in the future, really.
Yeah, we've talked about some of this already then, in terms of having jargon-free and clear writing, grabbing your attention and colours, but are there any other differences that you would say between a good and a not so good sort of poster?
Gosh, yeah. I'm obviously, I tend to use the phrase, and I'm not sure if it was, I'm just trying to think who would say it, is less is more. But I'm not sure, obviously I don't know who would actually have quoted that, but I think a poster that is not all singing or dancing, that feels like everything has been thrown at it. It's impactful for the wrong reason, because you're just thinking, oh gosh, where do I start in that poster? Whereas one that has been thoughtfully arranged in a subtle way, using less information, but well summarized and succinct and to the point, I think is probably more impactful than one that is everything in the kitchen sink thrown on top of it, really. I suppose that's how I would look at it. But I think it should have I don't know how you agree with yourselves on this, but I think it should still have the basic components, a reasonably good title that's then relates to an introductory component, some sort of analysis in there, and a concluding remark of some sort, at least if you're going to be using some written text in there. And that's probably enough. And of course, we mustn't forget that obviously references are important. If required, always check your assignment brief type of thing, really. So, and I think that's usually probably enough.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe some more visual elements, as in, let's say, if you have data, right, presenting it in graphs or tables, just to show the kind of weight of research behind it, or if it's a more kind of humanities orientated and not linked with quantitative data, maybe infographics could be a good addition that's allowed to grasp an idea at a glance.
Absolutely.
And I suppose that conclusion that you mentioned, that's also important, right? Because the idea is that the reader can establish what's the essence of this poster. What are your results? What's your what's the takeaway message from it? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think it's a very good point to make there. It's because a lot of the time, I'm talking from my kind of scientific background, that when students are first learning their sciences, they're kind of worried about the statistics and whether they understand it, and when they pull out a particularly in-depth paper to try and make sense of it, they're looking at the statistics in this, and they're trying to make sense of that. And I think a poster should go far enough to be able to help the person to be able to make that visual understanding of what's going on without having to try and work it out. And that perhaps is probably a good poster. So that infographics certainly gives that sense of perhaps scale, proportion, or averaging, or and you can do that in an amazing way. And if you're able to communicate that to a different audience who are not necessarily in your field, then I think you've achieved amazing feat in that sense. Because it might bring somebody else who's not necessarily so interested in your field suddenly feels that it can actually understand something there, and that's I think that's an important aspect of it. And obviously in a conference you get a range of different areas anyway, and that's kind of quite important in that sense. I know yourselves have experienced it, but it's just kind of sharing it with the others, I suppose. Really.
That's some really good points. We ask every guest to bring on an item And do you have an item, Jason? And would you like to tell us about how this connects to the theme of this week?
Well, I've actually got here. It's actually I don't know if you can see it here, but it's actually a lighthouse.
Amazing.
It's not quite Smeaton's tower. But I just thought I'd bring it in because it's one of those things that is visually representative of something that's known internationally, for starters. So if you show somebody a lighthouse, they could pretty much tell you anywhere in the world what that actually means, as long as they're obviously next to a coast of some sort, because obviously make allowances for people in there. But I think it has that international representation. And equally, it's a form of communication because obviously it's to stop to warn ships from going onto the rocks, and the lights being active and flashing is instantly recognized as I must stay away from there because I'm going to get into trouble. and it kind of speaks at so many levels, I think, in terms of how we might consider what a poster should be. It shouldn't be something we should have to spend too much time trying to work out. It's more about what immediately impacts me by looking at the visuals and just reading a little bit of the text. And if it conveys it that well, then obviously you've made the point in that sense. So I don't know if that's come across very well, but
I love that.
Yeah, it's great. It's like become a poster lamplighter.
Become a light in a darkened world.
Yeah. No, that's a great metaphor. Thank you. And also, when you look at the lighthouse visually, it's also well organized and has these stripes and the colors.
Absolutely.
And it's very neat in terms of what it represents and how it.
Absolutely, that's exactly it. Because I suppose that you could think of the little windows as being sort of stages of the writing as well. So there's kind of that organization to it, isn't it? That symmetry, I suppose, really. And if something has symmetry, it's also pleasing with the eye, and I think that's where a poster can be would fit best. But I have to come back again and say, obviously, with students who are probably doing the arts and stuff, they might be looking at more abstracts, and there's an abstract symmetry sometimes that gives a sense of hyperrealism when it doesn't. It's real, but it isn't real. So, but that's obviously going into another direction. But I think a sense of symmetry, I suppose, is quite important, really, for sure. Yeah.
Is technology in any way changing our relationship with posters or changing posters?
Yeah, it probably is. I certainly in the early days, I think you're talking about the digital interactive poster presentations, isn't it? DIPs or something, I think they call them as well. So the e-poster, isn't it? So I think I've seen it progress over the years, because it was at one point it was very exciting that you could have something on a screen and you could select it and it would zoom in, and people got very excited about that. But nowadays we're just kind of thinking, well, you just do pinch and zoom. But an interactive poster is probably where most people are probably thinking about going. Obviously, the availability of how you can
3D printer poster, or
that kind of thing. Yeah, it might be, but
projection
it might be
poster.
Yeah, exactly. But it could be sort of it could be electronic. It could be on one of those, a touch screen or something, where you can actually select certain things. It might play a particular somebody speaking, perhaps, or it allows you to integrate, visualize something a bit better, or it might give you play a video or something. So it goes a bit further than actually just sort of like the two-dimensional essence, if you like, of what it is. And I have seen it occasionally when I've been on campus, and I've seen the some of the presentations that are going on actually in the Roland Levinsky building. And some of the students are being very clever about it. They would do projections, and if you touch a certain area of the projected area, something might happen and things like that. So something that takes that interaction so much further, but it allows you to unearth extra detail. So, and what I like about that is that you can, if you're particularly attracted to a particular area of the poster and you select it and you get more information, then it feels like a nice surprise. It's like, oh, okay, sorry.
No, and we can actually already achieve it with regular posters as well, with QR codes, right, leading to additional information.
Absolutely, yes. This is it. There's also, I haven't experimented with it myself fully, but I have seen about, the augmented reality as well. Mm-hmm. So you can actually set it up on your poster, where if somebody was to use a particular app on their phone, you can hold the phone over the poster, and then certain parts of the poster would either present a different image, a virtual image, which appears on the screen, or it will play something or do something for you. So the interactivity doesn't necessarily have to be on the digital side of the actual poster. It can be a very plain poster, but you're using the app, where you'll let you make people aware that the app will allow you to actually do that. Yeah. And then you, as the creator in the background, would then create the visuals or the extra data from that interaction, so to speak. So
yeah, and in fact, in some high-tech places, some high-tech conferences, you have Second Life poster presentations where the presenter actually is not even there, but you come closer to the poster, and then it activates, and you kind of enter that Second Life reality. So it's really fascinating, especially, I suppose, in times of COVID, and who knows how it's going to develop in the future.
I didn't know that Second Life still existed. This is amazing. Fantastic.
Second Life, that was quite a hit. It's still going, isn't it? Yeah, I believe it is still going. Yes, yeah, but that was I had a few experiences there in Second Life as well. We had some instances, I think, in the past where we had a few lectures we went to as well. So I do remember that. But yeah, it allows that sort of like interactions and from a different perspective. Amazing. Yeah. So I think people probably have to Google Second Life 2 words and then find out what that means. But
it was popular in the early noughties.
It was probably in the early 90s, but it's a 3D interactive environment where you can bring things into it. And you could actually have a 2-dimensional poster in there. A kind of Alicia was kind of
that's fantastic
there as well. So.
It's the kind of thing that I think posters are the kind of thing that students are going to continue to push innovation, aren't they? With the way that they present, and I think that's fantastic.
Absolutely. And I think it's quite exciting in that sense. I suppose what we don't want to do is make them feel that if they don't put interaction on it, that it's all bad. Because I think to create a good 2D poster with some good imagery and stuff, is an achievement in itself. If you were to add a QR code, which is one of those little, sometimes they call them shop codes. It's basically you just scan it effectively, isn't it? That might give more information, or it might give a link to your work elsewhere and things like that. You don't have to go too complicated, but you can allow a certain amount of interaction, isn't it? I think that's how I feel about it anyway.
No, that sounds fabulous. Yeah, who knows what the future of the poster is, but it seems like there are endless opportunities really to express yourself as a researcher, as a student, as a scholar, right? And to interact with others in a probably more, well, I suppose the difference between a poster and a conference presentation, for example, where you read a paper, is that you have that more intimate relationship with the viewer. So someone approaches you, engage in a conversation about the poster, etc. But in a paper presentation, you have maybe more opportunity to outline your ideas with more depth, right? And but then you only have a very short Q&A that follows that. So posters have this additional, maybe sometimes frustrating, because I don't know how you have ever experienced poster presentations, but there's a certain level of awkwardness as well, where you kind of walk through, the lines and lines and lines of posters, and people are there waiting for you to engage with them, and then you kind of avoid the eye contact and try to you want to approach people, but then sometimes that conversation turns into an hour, but the poster presentations are an hour, and then you don't actually have enough time to engage with everything you would want to. So there are a lot of there's messiness in posters and poster presentations as well, which is the beauty of it, I suppose. But not everyone's comfortable with that.
No, I think I agree on that. It's there is that sense of awkwardness sometimes. But obviously the poster presentations, for those who haven't done it yet, obviously we're speaking openly about it, is that usually it happens at a break time or something. It's either assigned or it happens where there's food and drink happening. So the extra awkward day of auction is you're trying to balance your plates, hold a glass, and then have a conversation. But not to complain too much, because obviously it's a nice part of it, because obviously you can have it's a very informal, relaxed into that extent. But obviously you're then required to talk about your poster next to somebody where you're trying to eat your cake and drink your tea or coffee or whatever drink you're having at the time. So.
No, cake, tea, and a drink. I think that's our cue that we're done. We need a piece of cake now.
But that was a really rich discussion, Jason. Thank you so much for coming.
No, thank you for inviting me. It's been great. It's been good. So ask me along another time, by all means.
Will do. Thank you. I really enjoyed this, and I hope everyone else did. And thank you so much for watching or listening. Please do subscribe to the channel or the podcast, and maybe review us or leave a comment.
Only give 5 stars though.
Yeah, only 5 stars. Accept only 5 stars. But do also ask questions and let us know what's important to you to talk about, so we have a good excuse to invite Jason again to talk to us about what's important to you. So until next time, thank you.
Thank you, and keep learning.
Keep learning.